To get to the business end, or what to soon be the business end of the BRICS summit. We're going to talk to Chris Huttung about that. At least 22 countries, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, have formally asked to join the BRICS bloc. Another group of 22 also expressing interest in gaining their membership. So it comes back down to the core group, doesn't it? BRICS, of course, the acronym stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Going to be discussing all things, including geopolitics, trade and infrastructure in Johannesburg as of next week. There's been a lot of drama building up to this. We'll leave the Russia issue aside for now. We're not going to talk politics per se from the Russian side, but joining me to talk about what's expected and numbers-wise, also having had lots of coffee, I'm sure, this morning to unpack this for me, Chris Huttung, Head of Policy Analysis at the Centre for Risk Analysis, making time. Hello, Chris. Good to have you back on ENC. We're going to talk about the stumbling blocks that BRICS is going to have to deal with. We'll talk membership and potential memberships in a moment. But taking a look at some of the data you've done, it seems within the BRICS bloc, not all members are created equally. I'm getting a sense that China is still very much large and in charge, especially for South Africa within BRICS.
Good morning, Gareth. Absolutely. China, given its economic heft over the last 2 decades at least, how much economic growth it has managed to unlock. China has the most weight within BRICS. South Africa largely has a trade deficit with all of its BRICS partners. So that means overall we export more raw materials to those countries and we import more manufactured goods. Now, this also comes back down to our own policy, own goals, of course, for things like electricity and logistics. Given the lack of capacity of our manufacturing sector, we don't get as much value add from exporting more complicated, complex manufactured goods to our BRICS partners. This could hopefully change. And in the lead up to the BRICS summit, there are various other summits on the side going on, the latest of which was around agriculture. Agriculture, of course, one of the biggest economic sectors for South Africa. So hopefully we will see better trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, preferential agreements in that regard. But within those agreements and within BRICS largely, South Africa could continue to benefit more if we get some of our local policy decisions, as it were, correct.
Yeah, there's been criticism around BRICS for a long time now, and I don't want to go into the AGOA discussion. Perhaps you and I can have that discussion another day, but it's a BRICS versus AGOA at the moment. And I see part of the research you've done as well, and I want you to unpack this for me, is a concept called near-shoring. The little bit that I understand is because, as you say, we're giving away a lot more to BRICS than we're actually getting. What does this near-shoring hope to achieve?
So over the last few years, exacerbated by things like the COVID-19 pandemic, but also ramped up trade wars between the US and China, you're seeing companies in the US and in Western countries in Europe moving their supply chains and value chains away from places like China. So concerns around Chinese government policy, possibly conflict around Taiwan in the future. Chinese companies and, US companies and the US government, they are asking questions about should those supply chains and value chains still be supplied and located in China. Now, that means they are providing subsidies, for example, for companies to move back to places like the US to build factories there, to build factories in Europe, but also exploring other places for investment like Southeast Asia, possibly Latin America, and also especially Africa in the context of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which will hopefully see a more liberalized trade and investment environment. Yeah. So this idea now of reshoring or friendshoring or nearshoring, countries loosely associated with the West and with the US, those trade agreements and relationships taking on different forms. I don't think you're going to see a hard decoupling between the US and China, between those economies. It would be bad for both of those to the tune of trillions of dollars. But you are seeing a bit of a shift of supply chains and value chains. And if we could make that investment case in South Africa, especially if we could get some of those basics right around logistics and energy, as well as crime and security, you could see those more advanced companies, especially in terms of technology, moving their manufacturing to places like South Africa, which comes with the benefit not just of job creation, but more tax revenue for the fiscus, for government, which is under pressure, and also the sharing of skills and intellectual property that then in turn helps the South African economy as a whole. So I think there's a great opportunity there. It comes with risks. You need to balance the different interests, as it were, between the US and China. But there is now this sort of flux of supply chains around the world. So a country like South Africa, still being the most advanced economy on the African continent, could take advantage of this sort of state of flux at the moment.
I want to ask, as I say goodbye to you, Chris, as well. I didn't mean to take up too much time with nearshoring. My apologies. But so the membership potentially going to grow with the BRICS. It could become a very long acronym. It might be a full sentence in a couple of years from now. How would we benefit by getting other countries into BRICS? And I mean from the South African perspective, because the more you bring in, the more you dilute potentially, or you could argue the more opportunities. What's your view on that as I say goodbye?
At the moment, I'm leaning towards the more opportunities, so more opportunities for trade and investment. And in the context, a global context of higher inflation, higher interest rates, if you have more avenues for investment and capital to flow, if those countries are part of something like BRICS, it could facilitate easy investment. As you rightly say, need to balance all of the interests and the various interest groups. But I think in the long term, there could be a strong case to be made for more investment if these relationships are built upon over the long term.
Yeah, as I mentioned, some of the countries, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, I'm dying to know what that acronym could look like one day as we start adding more countries. Chris Hattingh, always good to hear from Chris, of course.